I had just finished going through the last stack of papers that Brian handed me. These documents were critical for him to manage a major portfolio I was still overseeing. This portfolio involved none other than Alexander Monroe, the billionaire investor everyone knew for his ruthless tactics. Alexander was infamous for using his immense wealth to orchestrate hostile takeovers. He'd snatch up enough stock to seize control of companies, and once he was in charge, he'd tear them apart, selling off assets for profit with no regard for the trail of destruction he left behind. As Alexander's lawyer and occasional adversary in the legal arena, my role was to make sure his business dealings stayed clean and compliant with SEC rules. By keeping him out of trouble with the feds, I also helped grow his fortune, which, in turn, brought a lot of revenue to our firm, Bradley, Livingston, and Scott Associates. Brian, meanwhile, was making great strides managing other clients' portfolios. He was gearing up to take over completely within 2 weeks, marking the end of a 3-month process of me transitioning all my clients, except for a select few. Only Brian, Lauren Livingston, and Will Scott knew about my impending retirement. It was a decision I reminded myself about often. It was time to focus on my personal life for a change. As one of the founding partners, alongside Lauren and Owen Bradley, I had seen our little law office grow into one of the most prominent firms in Columbus, Ohio. But that success had come at a personal cost, especially when it came to my marriage with Claire. Claire and I just celebrated our 20th anniversary last month, but the cracks in our relationship were hard to ignore. We had 2 wonderful kids, Michael, 19, and Sophie, 18, both thriving in college. Despite having every material comfort we could ask for, Claire's indifference toward our intimacy weighed heavily on me. I still felt that desire to connect with her, but she brushed off her disinterest as something temporary, always saying she'd talk to her doctor about it. She'd been promising that for almost a year now, but nothing had changed, and I'd stopped bringing it up. Adding to my frustration were Claire's increasingly frequent trips back to her hometown of Springfield. She claimed she needed to help her ailing mother and give her sister, Lydia, who had recently divorced, a hand. Lydia lived alone, and Claire's visits supposedly provided her a much-needed break. These trips started about 6 months ago and had become routine. Claire would leave every other Thursday morning and come back late Sunday night, checking in with nightly calls at 9. While she was always reachable by phone, the long weekends alone left me resentful. This morning, Claire left again. I told her I was planning a big surprise for her in a couple of weeks. I even dropped Lauren's name into the conversation, hoping to pique her interest, or maybe even spark a little jealousy, but she didn't bat an eye. She just kept packing, said her goodbyes, and headed out the door. Later, I went into the office, wrapped up some tasks, chatted briefly with Amy, my secretary, and made my way to Lauren's office. I knocked once before stepping inside, a casual habit between us partners. "Hey, Lauren," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "How about we call it a day and grab a drink?" Lauren smiled but shook her head. "I'd love to, but I've got plans. Mark and I are heading to our son's school play tonight. He's playing the lead in Pirates of Doom." I teased her about the play's title, saying parents always think their kids are stars. Lauren laughed, clearly proud of her son. At 46, she had been happily married to Mark for over a decade and seemed to radiate a kind of contentment I often envied. She reassured me about an ongoing project, saying she didn't need Brian's help and that everything was running smoothly. She also brought up my retirement again, saying she hoped I'd reconsider, even though she respected my decision. "You've done so much for this firm, Jack," she said warmly. "It won't be the same without you." I assured her that she, Owen, and the younger team members, especially Brian, would steer the firm to even greater heights. I even floated the idea of promoting Melanie Gardner to partner soon, which she seemed to agree with. After wrapping up our conversation, I wished her good night and headed out. Driving home to my estate in the Columbus suburbs, I couldn't help but think how empty the place felt these days. The property was massive, a 5-acre spread with a 5,000-square-foot house, a pool flowing into a hot tub, tennis courts, and gardens that seemed to stretch forever. With Michael and Sophie off at college, the house felt far too big for just the two of us. Claire had even let go of the cook and maid, leaving the space eerily quiet. Claire had been talking about downsizing lately, but I wasn't quite ready to let go of the house just yet. I figured we could hold off a couple more years before making any big moves. Pulling into the 4-car garage that evening, I stepped into the silence of the kitchen. The house, as usual, felt far too large for just one person. I grabbed a frozen dinner, tossed it in the microwave, and headed upstairs to change into something comfortable. By the time I came back down, the landline rang, a rare sound these days. I picked up the phone, half hoping it was about one of the ads I'd placed. Sure enough, it was about my boat, a 32-foot powered sailboat I'd kept docked at Lake Erie during the summer months. A prospective buyer had taken it for a test run recently, and the marina owner, acting on my behalf, vouched for its excellent condition. The deal wrapped up quickly, with the buyer agreeing to send a cashier's check to the P.O. box I provided. Once the funds cleared, I'd hand over the title at the marina. Selling the boat felt like a small victory. Claire had never been fond of it, and hadn't set foot on it in years. With my Jaguar and Audi also up for sale and my retirement plan moving steadily along, I was well on my way to simplifying my life. Downsizing the house would take more time, but I'd already started moving furniture into a cozy bungalow that Claire and I would eventually call home. Dinner was uneventful, eaten more out of habit than hunger. I grabbed a cold Miller Lite, settled into the entertainment room, and turned on the TV, hoping for a distraction. Flipping through channels, I landed on an adult movie, but it didn't hold my attention for long. The so-called plot was laughable, predictable and repetitive, offering nothing remotely engaging. I turned it off, mildly annoyed. Right on time, at 9 o'clock, Claire called. Her voice was calm, almost detached, as she recounted her day. She said the trip had been uneventful, though her mother's health had shown slight improvement. She mentioned her sister Lydia was stressed, which wasn't exactly news to me. Then she asked if it would be okay to stay an extra day to help out more. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach but told her to do whatever she thought was best. "Are you sure?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Of course," I replied, trying to keep things casual. "It's lonely here without you anyway. I might stay late at the office tomorrow." I also asked if she needed anything for Monday, pointing out that she hadn't packed much for this trip. She brushed it off, explaining she'd left some items at her mom's house on a previous visit. Then, to my surprise, she brought up the big surprise I'd hinted at earlier. "So, what's this big thing you're working on?" she asked, a hint of curiosity creeping into her voice. Caught off guard, I paused for a moment. "It's coming along," I said finally. "Lauren's almost done with her part. You'll see soon enough." Claire promised to call again the next night, wished me good night, and ended the call with a lukewarm "I love you." The words felt rushed, almost perfunctory, and left me wondering if she even meant them. Still, I chose to interpret it as her being preoccupied with her family's situation. As I hung up, I couldn't help but reflect on how dysfunctional Claire's family was. Her overbearing mother and self-centered sister, Lydia, had always been sources of tension. Lydia's infidelity had destroyed her marriage, and now Claire was stuck picking up the pieces. Meanwhile, I faced another weekend alone. Looking for some comfort, I called Michael and Sophie. Talking to my kids always lifted my spirits, and tonight was no exception. We chatted for over an hour, catching up on their college lives and laughing about old stories. I reminded them of our plans in 2 weeks, feeling lighter as we said our goodbyes. Later, I settled onto the couch, only to drift off and wake up in the middle of the night with a stiff neck. Groaning, I shuffled upstairs to bed and, for once, slept soundly without the unsettling dreams that had been haunting me lately. The next 2 weeks flew by in a blur of work and preparation. I focused on finalizing my cases and ensuring Brian was ready to take over my responsibilities. Most of my clients were on board with the transition, though a few needed extra reassurance. I arranged for Lauren or Will to meet with those clients, smoothing things over as much as possible. By the time Claire left for Springfield again on Thursday, everything was in place. Interestingly, she seemed to have forgotten all about the surprise I'd mentioned earlier. I decided not to remind her, thinking it would be better to bring it up during her Sunday call, especially if she mentioned staying an extra day. Either way, I was ready. Friday, my last day at work, was a whirlwind. Megan and I spent the morning cleaning out my office and transferring the last of the paper files to Brian. I instructed her to forward all new calls to him, sticking to the plan. Since Megan and Brian worked well together, he'd be keeping her on as his secretary. Before leaving, I stopped by Lauren's office to confirm everything was set for the transition. Despite her packed schedule, including a courthouse appearance that morning, she promised to make it back in time for my retirement party at the Haven Hotel. Claire wouldn't be attending, of course, but that didn't bother me. After lunch, I tied up a few final loose ends. By 3 o'clock, everything was squared away. The house paperwork was signed, and the movers were scheduled to finish the job by late Saturday. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of relief, and maybe even a flicker of excitement, for what was to come. I had arranged for a professional cleaning crew to come in after the movers finished their job. I even offered them a generous bonus to ensure the house would be spotless by evening. The realtors had assured me that the for sale sign would be up by Sunday morning, and there were already several eager buyers lined up to view the property on Monday. I had priced the house aggressively to ensure a quick sale, no sense in dragging it out. While the house transition moved forward, I took one last look at our financial setup. Claire and I had always maintained separate accounts alongside a joint one, and I insisted on minimal credit usage. It was a habit of mine to keep things debt-free, and Claire was good about managing our shared finances. What she didn't concern herself with, and rarely even remembered, were my private accounts and the firm's finances. That blind spot made it easy to quietly close our joint accounts and transfer the retirement funds into a brokerage account under my sole control. For now, I planned to cover any joint expenses in cash, especially since our new home wasn't even in the country. I had already set up an international account with a global bank, giving us access to funds across Europe and South America. Knowing Claire's knack for handling money, I was confident she'd adapt to the new arrangement. I double-checked our tickets for an extended stay at a luxury resort in Costa Rica. The place was stunning, pristine beaches, endless sunshine, and activities like sailing and horseback riding. I had personally visited the resort to make sure it met my standards, leaving nothing to chance. Megan, my ever-reliable secretary, had handled all the travel arrangements, ensuring every detail was perfectly aligned. Over the years, my career as a high-profile attorney had brought in a substantial fortune. Between hefty retainers from wealthy clients and calculated investments in high-risk accounts, I'd quietly amassed significant wealth. Using my legal expertise, I'd shifted much of it into offshore accounts. Everything was above board, of course, but those accounts were entirely out of reach from U.S. taxes and laws. Claire had no idea they existed, and if she ever learned their true value, I imagine it would leave her speechless. Still, I believed my retirement and the surprises I had planned would make her happy. She had been urging me to step back from work for years, often complaining about how much time I spent at the office. This getaway was my way of giving her the lifestyle she'd always wanted. The big reveal was set for Sunday night when she returned, or, if she extended her trip, during her morning call. I had rehearsed it in my mind a dozen times, confident she'd be thrilled once she saw what I had planned. That evening, my retirement party was a smashing success. I mingled with old colleagues, danced with the women, and shared stories with the men about the firm's most memorable cases. Brian stuck close, soaking up every bit of advice I could offer. I trusted him completely and saw him as the future of the firm. Lauren and Owen, sworn to secrecy, knew every detail of my plans. While dancing with Lauren, she offered her quiet approval of my decisions. She confirmed that all the necessary documentation was in place, and reassured me that everything would align perfectly with the surprise for Claire. "Jessica's going to love it," I said, grinning as I spun her around. Lauren smirked. "Let's hope so. But if she doesn't, I'm sure Costa Rica will soften the blow." We both laughed, the kind of easy camaraderie built from years of partnership. I mentioned the tickets for our trip and promised to call her once settled, sharing my new permanent number. I even joked that she and Owen should consider a similar escape someday. She smiled but shook her head. "I love my work too much to walk away yet," she said. The party lasted until nearly midnight. On my way out, I checked my phone and saw I'd missed Claire's call. Her voicemail was brief and distant. She explained she'd decided to stay at her mother's for the night and asked me not to call, claiming her mother needed rest. She promised to check in the next evening and ended the message with a flat "Be home." It wasn't exactly warm, but it wasn't unusual either. As expected, Claire didn't call again that night. I spent the remainder of the evening carefully packing both my belongings and hers. I wanted everything to be perfectly organized, leaving no room for complaints or accusations of carelessness. Time was running short, and I was determined to avoid any unnecessary return trips once the movers finished the next day. With everything packed, I made arrangements to stay at the bungalow that night. I forwarded all calls to my new cell number starting the next morning, ensuring everything was in place. Before heading to bed, I made one final phone call to confirm the last detail of the surprise. Lying down, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and nervous anticipation. The party from earlier still lingered in my mind, leaving me both physically drained and emotionally on edge. I just hoped nothing would derail my plans. Saturday arrived, and with it, a whirlwind of activity. The movers showed up early, efficiently packing and loading the furniture from the house. As I watched them work, a small pang of sadness crept in. This house had been our home for years, filled with memories, good and bad. But I quickly shrugged off the sentimentality. There was no room for nostalgia in this transition. Instead of wallowing in the sadness of packing up the house, I drove straight to the bungalow to meet Michael and Sophie. They were scheduled to arrive around noon, and it was time to bring them fully into the loop. They already knew I was retiring, but I hadn't yet shared the full extent of my plans, especially the move to Costa Rica. Most importantly, I needed their promise not to call Claire and accidentally spoil the surprise. When they arrived, I greeted them warmly and wasted no time sitting them down to explain everything. I laid out the details as clearly and concisely as I could, answering their questions and filling in the gaps where needed. Their reactions weren't exactly enthusiastic. Michael and Sophie seemed uneasy, even skeptical, about the drastic changes I was making. But I reassured them that their college tuition was fully paid, and no matter where I ended up, they would always have a place to call home. "This is something your mom and I have discussed for a long time," I told them, presenting the decision as logical and well thought out. "It's time for me to step back and start living life on my own terms." They weren't entirely convinced and insisted on speaking to Claire about it. I firmly but calmly asked them to wait until she returned on Sunday night, emphasizing the importance of keeping the surprise intact. Reluctantly, they agreed. Later that evening, we went out for dinner, keeping the conversation light despite the undercurrent of tension. When Claire called at 9, I kept the conversation brief. She sounded distant, as usual, and made no mention of extending her stay, so I still expected her back on Sunday. After hanging up, Michael and Sophie circled back to their concerns about my plans. I reassured them again, emphasizing that everything was under control and there was no need to worry. Once they were asleep in the spare room, I turned my focus back to the logistics. I made another round of phone calls to confirm that the movers had finished and the cleaning crew was on schedule. Everything was falling into place. Before calling it a night, I made one final call to double-check the last detail of the surprise. Satisfied with the updates, I went to bed feeling a mix of anticipation and weariness. Sunday morning was calm, with little left to do. I checked the house one last time and found it spotless. The movers and cleaners had done an exceptional job, leaving the property in perfect condition for the upcoming showings. With that taken care of, I returned to the bungalow and waited for Claire's call, which I expected between 10 o'clock and 10:30. Michael and Sophie had gone out to see some friends, leaving me alone to take the call when it came. The phone rang, and I picked up immediately, keeping my tone steady. "Are you ready to come home?" I asked. Claire's voice was strained, hesitant, as she said she wanted to stay a few more days to help Lydia with some tasks. I could hear the unease in her voice, as if she knew this wouldn't go over well. She was right. Months of frustration, anger, and betrayal surged to the surface. She wanted to stay longer, again? I already knew why. I'd known for months, long enough to plan the intricate surprise I had crafted. My anger broke through, and although I tried to keep my voice steady, it trembled with suppressed rage. "Why don't you just stay as long as you like, with Evan?" I snapped, the venom in my voice unmistakable. Before she could respond, I continued. I confronted her about her affair with Evan Cooper and her involvement with another man, Matt Reed. The betrayal I had endured in silence for months spilled out in a torrent of accusations. My voice rose as I detailed what I knew, the motels, the meetings, the lies. Claire said nothing, only stifled a sob before abruptly hanging up. For a moment, I sat frozen, staring at the phone in disbelief. She hung up. After everything I had just said, she simply disconnected the line. I set the phone down with trembling hands, my anger boiling over with no outlet. Slumping into a chair, I tried to process what had just happened, but the shock left me numb. Minutes later, the disposable phone I had purchased for emergencies began ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. The lack of voicemail meant it rang incessantly until I finally answered. "Yes," I said flatly, my voice devoid of emotion. It was Lydia on the other end, her tone panicked and angry. She demanded to know what I had said to Claire, accusing me of upsetting her to the point of hysteria. My frustration shifted gears, now directed squarely at Lydia, who I believed was complicit in Claire's betrayal. "Why don't you ask Evan?" I shot back bitterly, my sarcasm sharp enough to cut. I accused both her and Claire of orchestrating these deceptions with Evan and Matt, recounting the details of their meetings and lies. My voice grew louder as I unloaded my grievances, though I stopped short of shouting. Lydia tried to defend Claire, insisting it wasn't what I thought and blaming the entire situation on a stupid mistake, one she admitted to playing a part in. She begged me not to do anything drastic and to give Claire a chance to explain. I cut her off coldly. "I've already made arrangements. Someone will be there when Claire gets back. But it won't be me." I informed Lydia that I had already told Michael and Sophie the truth, including the reality of Claire's supposed weekends helping her mother. Lydia sounded horrified, but I ended the call abruptly, telling her the kids had taken the news surprisingly well. I wasn't interested in hearing any more excuses or pleas. The line went silent, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. The events of the morning had left me drained, but the clarity of my next steps kept me grounded. There was no going back now. Jessica's betrayal was undeniable, and I was determined not to let her twist the story into something it wasn't. Saren's frantic attempts to plead her case only solidified my resolve. I reminded her coldly that it wasn't me who tore the family apart, it was her and Jessica. With a sharp finality, I said goodbye, adding a cutting remark about how their mother, who had always despised me, was probably laughing her bony ass off at the chaos they'd caused. I ended the call and stood in the quiet bungalow, taking one last look around. "Jessica will love it," I muttered with a bitter chuckle, the irony of the moment heavy in the air. I switched off the lights, placed a set of spare keys and a letter for Jessica on the table, and walked out the door. As it clicked shut behind me, a strange sense of closure washed over me. The weight of years of frustration and deceit seemed to dissipate, replaced by a hollow calm. I climbed into the rental car and drove to Megan's apartment, where she was waiting outside with her luggage. Her face lit up with a bright smile as I pulled up. I stepped out, loaded her 3 suitcases into the back, and opened the passenger door for her. Megan slid in with a confident grin, her excitement palpable. As I settled into the driver's seat, she turned to me, unable to hide her joy. "It was so hard seeing you every day at work, pretending there was nothing between us," she said, her voice brimming with emotion. "Jessica didn't appreciate you, she practically handed you over to me." Her words stung, even though they were meant to reassure me. Megan credited Jessica's neglect for the opportunity to grow closer to me, and she spoke of our weekends together as if they were the culmination of a love story. I remained quiet, focused on the road ahead. That evening, Jessica would later recall, she hadn't sensed anything was wrong. When I asked the usual question, "Are you coming home?" she believed my tone was calm, even normal, and saw no reason to suspect otherwise. Feeling reassured, she pressed on with her request to stay a few extra days. She glanced at Saren, who offered an encouraging smile, and reminded herself that I had never objected before. Why would I now? She had convinced herself that her secrets were safe, that I would never discover the truth. Jessica insisted to herself that she still loved me, truly, but admitted that our intimacy had lost its spark long ago. The affair wasn't about love. It was about rediscovering a part of herself she hadn't realized was missing. Evan awakened something primal in her, something she told herself was harmless, even beneficial for our marriage. She had deluded herself into believing these dalliances would ultimately strengthen her feelings for me. But when my voice came through the phone, calm yet razor-sharp with accusation, her facade crumbled. "Why would I care if you stay longer, Jessica?" I said, my tone cold and deliberate. "I'm sure Evan or Matt can keep you company." The precise nature of my accusations, 6 months or more of deception, betrayal, and lies, left her stunned. Panic gripped her, and she slammed the phone down, her sobs echoing in Saren's quiet kitchen. In that moment, she realized the delicate web of lies she had spun had completely unraveled. I knew everything. Terrified that she was about to lose the man she claimed to love, Jessica grabbed her car keys and bolted. Saren's protest faded as she sped down the driveway. The 3.5-hour trip to Columbus felt like an eternity. She ignored speed limits, pushing the car as fast as it could safely go. With trembling hands on the wheel, she rehearsed what she would say. She'd insist Evan and Matt meant nothing, that their relationships were meaningless mistakes fueled by Saren's misguided encouragement. Saren had convinced her that exploring something new and forbidden would reignite her passion and save our marriage. But as the miles passed, Jessica began to recognize the absurdity of her own excuses. Why hadn't we been intimate for 6 months? Why had she chosen deceit instead of honesty? She had no real answers, only mounting regret and a desperate hope for forgiveness. When she finally pulled into the driveway, her stomach dropped. There were already cars there, Michael's, Sophie's, and others she didn't recognize. Panic gave way to dread as she parked hastily on the grass and ran to the front door. Her hands fumbled with the keys, but the lock wouldn't budge. She tried again and again, frustration giving way to despair, until she threw the key onto the porch and collapsed against the door, her body shaking with sobs. When she lifted her head, her tear-filled eyes locked on a man standing nearby. He had stepped out of an unfamiliar car when she arrived, but in her frantic state, she had ignored him. Now, he stood silently, watching her with an unreadable expression, a mix of pity and determination. Jessica's mind raced. Who was this man? Why was he here? And more urgently, what was she supposed to do now? The man standing before me had a composed, professional demeanor. His voice was calm but firm as he asked, "Mrs. Harris?" I managed a mute nod, my throat too tight to respond. He extended an envelope toward me. "You are served, ma'am," he said, his tone clipped and formal. Before I could fully process his words, he pulled out another, smaller envelope and handed it over. "These are the keys to your new residence," he continued. "The address is inside, and the property is entirely yours, free of any financial obligations. The deed and all relevant documents are included." My hands trembled as I accepted the envelopes, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. My mind was a fog of pain and confusion. The man wasn't finished. From his coat pocket, he retrieved a larger legal-sized envelope and handed it over. "This contains checks equal to the balances of your savings and checking accounts, which have been closed. This house is listed for sale, and the proceeds will be sent to you once the transaction is complete. Everything is outlined in the divorce documentation, including the terms Mr. Harris has agreed to." He closed his briefcase with a final, deliberate motion that echoed in the silent air. Then, reaching into his jacket one last time, he pulled out a business card and placed it in my hand. "This is your husband's attorney's contact information. If you have any questions, direct them to her." With that, he turned on his heel and walked briskly to his car. He stopped briefly to speak to someone in another vehicle parked nearby, then drove off, leaving me standing alone. I clutched the envelopes, the words, "divorce documentation," reverberating in my head. Glancing at the business card, my heart sank. The name printed neatly at the top was Lauren Livingston. A surge of anger flared up inside me but fizzled just as quickly, replaced by a deep, gnawing regret. Lauren, my scapegoat for years, the person I had weaponized to guilt Chester, had always been an easy target. Now, the truth was unavoidable. The problem wasn't her. It had always been me. As if summoned by my thoughts, Lauren appeared. She approached with a calm yet piercing gaze that seemed to see straight through me. "Hello, Jessica," she said coolly, her tone sharp with judgment. "You don't look so well today." I couldn't respond. My throat was too tight, my chest too heavy. Lauren continued, her words measured but laced with disdain. "Chester asked me to handle everything in his absence. If you have questions, I can provide answers." Her expression hardened as she pressed on. "First, Chester retired on Friday. We threw him a wonderful farewell party. Lots of people came to celebrate him. Too bad you couldn't be there. But of course, you had other priorities, didn't you?" Each word landed like a hammer blow, but Lauren wasn't done. "Second, this house has been turned over to a realtor for sale. You granted Chester power of attorney some time ago, and he used it to transfer the title into his name. But don't worry, the proceeds are entirely yours. Chester wanted you to have them as part of the divorce settlement. He also purchased a fully furnished bungalow for you. Your children can take you there." I opened my mouth to speak, but Lauren cut me off with her next revelation. "Finally, Chester has given me full authority to manage his affairs and represent him in the divorce. He has left the country and has no intention of returning anytime soon." Her words crushed me. My legs felt like they might give out as I tried to comprehend the weight of what she was saying. My breathing grew shallow, and a wave of nausea swept over me. Lauren's tone softened slightly, but the reproach was still there. "I can't pretend to understand why you did what you did to Chester," she said steadily. "I've worked with him for 15 years, and I know he loved you and your children more than anything. Finding out about your affairs nearly broke him." I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. "But Mark and I convinced him to stay strong," Lauren continued, her voice unwavering. "We reminded him of Jacob and Ella. That's what saved him. Now he's with someone who cares for him, a kind, loving woman who helped him through the pain you caused. It doesn't matter who she is. What matters is that she's there for him now." Her gaze bore into mine. "Chester doesn't want to see you, Jessica. He won't agree to any conversations, and he doesn't care if you fight the divorce. That will be my battle, not his. Do whatever you want, but Chester is out of your life for good." With that, Lauren turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the driveway, reeling from her words. She climbed into the passenger seat of a waiting car, and without a backward glance, they drove off. Numb, I stumbled toward the cars where Jacob and Sophie stood silently. Their expressions, anger, disappointment, disgust, were unbearable. When my knees buckled, Jacob reached out to steady me, but his touch was cold, devoid of the warmth I had once relied on. Sophie stood with her arms crossed, her face a mirror of her brother's fury. She didn't move to comfort me. Their silent judgment was a pain sharper than I had ever imagined. Tears poured down my face as I crumbled under the weight of my grief. I had lost everything. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Whether it's your opinion, a question, or just something you'd like to add, your voice matters. Let's start a conversation.